Live from the SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, welcome to this midweek edition of the Watchdog, and thank you for joining us. Now, following the release today of independent schools' matric results and tomorrow's expected release of those from public schools, tens of thousands of South African youth are gearing themselves for tertiary education this year. Now, for first-timers especially, it can be an intimidating environment full of uncertainty and grief, usually brought about by such things as lack of money to enroll or failure to secure places at higher education institutions. Now, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic period, many of you will also remember the often violent protests we have also witnessed. Now, tonight on the program, we'll look at some of the work taking place behind the scenes to avert some of the crises that we have seen before. We also talk to some of the stakeholders about the state of readiness of the tertiary education sector to receive new students. The Watchdog starts now. According to the Independent Examinations Board, when it published its results today, the class of 2021's National Senior Certificate pass rate is 98.39%, with nearly all of them, 89.2% to be exact, achieving entry to degree study at a tertiary level. Now, that's 13,825 young South Africans, many of whom will be seeking admission to the country's tertiary institutions. And that's just those who studied at private schools. Now, take a look at how some of these young people reacted today after receiving their results. Well done to them indeed. And as I was saying earlier, tomorrow the Minister of Basic Education and her team will announce the results of public schools. Now, for some of these young people, though, tears and heartbreak often follow that joy and excitement you just saw, due to such things as lack of funds, failure to secure places at institutions, or enroll in the fields of their choice. And sometimes, as we have seen in years gone by, violent protests. Now, over the past couple of days, the Office of the Public Protector has been holding meetings with key stakeholders, ostensibly to avoid any possible crisis. Deputy Public Protector Koleka Galega is on standby to talk us through what they have been doing. She will later be joined by some of the key stakeholders we've lined up, among them Universities South Africa CEO Professor Ahmed Bauer, who will also shed some light on the state and level of readiness of the country's universities. Advocate Galega, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. What exactly have you been doing as the Office of the Public Protector in this space over the past couple of days?
Good evening to you. Good evening to the viewers, and thank you for having Public Protector South Africa on the Watchdog. Over the past 2 days, really what we have been doing has been a continuation of work which we had started last year. In the first quarter of the year, wherein we embarked on an inspection in loco in the various institutions of higher learning in the country, which was sparked by the violent protests and outcries by students throughout the country. And we further thereafter received a complaint from SASFE, which is the student body, wherein they were laying out certain grievances which they had against the Department of Higher Education as well as the NSS. Now, Thereafter, we then embarked on an investigation. We then divided our investigation into two: hardcore investigation and the other part into the mediation process, which is in terms of Section 6, subsection 4B of the Public Protector Act, wherein we then opt to sit down with parties in an amicable way to try and find solutions to the challenges which are facing the higher education sector in the country. So yesterday and today was a culmination of those talks, wherein we engage several stakeholders who are involved and key stakeholders within the higher education sector.
Now, that background is important because I was looking earlier at people who were reacting to what your office posted, which I retweeted. And some people are saying, tell us about your next investigations and not get involved in things that are, far away from you or don't constitute your core mandate. And I think that background speaks to that question. Now, who then did you meet over the past couple of days?
Yesterday, we met the universities of South Africa. We met with the South African Police Service. We met with NFSIS, and throughout the meetings which we had, the Alternative Dispute Resolution Forums, we had SASFE represented. Now, the background behind meeting universities of South Africa is because this is now the board of the vice chancellors, and it is critical because the management of the institution is in their hands, and there are critical issues that had been raised by SASFE. For example, the withholding of the degree or qualification certificates at the end of the qualification, and further the issues of the close off at the end of the academic year, which takes place between the universities and NFSIS. The South African Police Service, because issues of security and campuses and around campuses had been raised by the students, wherein a lot of students are attacked just outside of campuses, outside accommodation. But further that, NFSIS had a challenge of fraud themselves, where a number of students through the tertiary institutions which we had visited had raised cases of fraud where they had been defrauded of their NFSIS money. But NFSIS had also raised with us some fraudulent actions which had taken place within the system. Now, we, even before yesterday and today, work had been taking place. We had interacted with SAPS on behalf of NFSIS to intervene on these issues and also raise with them the security issues which are happening outside of campuses and which impede on the performance of students within their campuses.
Well, quite a number of issues there, and maybe let's go through them. Let's isolate them and go through them one by one. Let's start with what the universities, the issues that the universities have actually raised with you. A little later on, of course, we'll be joined in this conversation by the CEO of Universities South Africa, Professor Bauer. But what in the main were the issues that the universities were raising, especially those that are going to impact, the beginning of this new year, on the back, of course, of all the uncertainty that has been brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic?
In the main, what we discussed with the universities is really, firstly, let me say that the The conversation was really a conversation of togetherness, where we all approached it with the spirit of finding solutions, and there was serious cooperation amongst all the parties involved. And the critical issues were the issues of the withholding of the certificates, where all the parties involved indeed said there needs to be a way wherein which we ensure that there is a manner in which the students, after they had acquired their qualification, are able to prove that they are in possession of a certain qualification, which will enable them to enter the employment market, so that those of them who have debts are able to pay back their debts. And I think the discussions around that were quite fruitful, as University of South Africa indicated that immediately when they received the allegations letter from Public Protector South Africa, they convened the board and they discussed the issues which we had raised, and found that indeed it is issues that they can find a way around and ensure that those issues are being resolved. The other issue was the issue of the close off, where really there was challenges between NSFAS and the universities to ensure that confirmation of payments are being done, and there's a close off that is being made. There's really consensus that they need to find a way around dealing with that to ensure that it is done speedily. As soon as NSFAS approves the payments, the universities are able to pick it up and close off is able to be made. And the other issue really was the accessibility and the communication between the universities and NSFAS and the students on campus and NSFAS.
Now, how are they proposing then to deal with if your conversations were solutions oriented, as you were saying? What then is the proposal of the universities? Are they going to give students who may not have fully settled their fees, such proof of qualification, so they can then go and get the job, so they're in turn able to pay back?
Indeed, Vuyo, that is the spirit, that they will find a way of furnishing some proof that the student had completed a certain qualification. However, the certificate cannot be issued due to the outstanding debt. So the conversations are around that line.
Okay, and with regards to NSFAS and the closing off, confirmations of payment, what was the final position? What did you all arrive at the end?
What has been arrived at here is what I had mentioned earlier on, that NSFAS and the universities of South Africa are going to have to find a way of ensuring that there is a speedy resolution on the close off, and that also speaks to the allocation of the officials who are responsible for the tasks on the university side.
Okay, now, if you then, from the reports that you initially did as the Office of the Public Protector, what from those were the issues that you as the office put before the Vice Chancellors of universities? What were your key concerns or issues going into these meetings?
The issues which I have mentioned are the key issues which we had put forward, because those are the issues in line with the complaints that we had received, that in generally just ensuring that there is a spirit amongst all stakeholders involved within the higher education sector to try and resolve the challenges that face the students day to day, particularly at the beginning of each academic year. And just to give a brief history on that, is that Throughout last year, we had been working very closely with the universities and NFSs to resolve the disputes which students had brought before us, which had included the disputes of registration, disputes of decline of NFSs, and from both sides, from the universities, we had received quite a cooperation as most of these matters had been resolved case by case.
But were there no other issues from the students in particular? I mean, there were before. I mean, issues of housing, for example, that were raised in the past. There is, of course, still the issue of the missing middle. You know, did you get into those areas?
Yes, we did, Vuyo. Those are the areas which we spoke on day 2, which was today. As you had indicated, you had wanted us to deal with day 1, and which was focused on the universities of South Africa. And then today on day 2, we then dealt with the issues of the accommodation, the issues of the missing middle, which deals with the funding model of the higher education sector, wherein the Department of Higher Education and Training was represented by the Deputy Minister, wherein we also had NFSs, we had National Treasury represented by the Director General. We also had the Presidency, which was represented by the Chief Operations Officer, and we also have the Interministerial Task Team on the platform.
And what was arrived at with regard to your missing middle specifically?
Those issues are part of the work that the Interministerial Task Team was tasked with. Now, that report has not yet been finalized and made public. It is still under process. So at this stage, really, I'm not in a position to divulge what were the intake issues which were discussed in that respect. But what I can say is that there is a spirit to attend to these issues. But of course, as we know, our country is faced with a shortage of finances. So all the discussions that we were having and all the aspirations that all the parties were having in trying to resolve the challenges indeed are within the budgetary constraints.
That understood, and of course, I also, take your point about being unable to, say much as there are processes in place. But did it sound like, there is a solution pending? Did it sound to you like progress is indeed being made? In other words, come, the next budget cycle, for example, there may just be a new regime in place, or some solutions, are coming.
Indeed, Vuyo, they've worked extensively to find solutions. They might not be absolute solutions as we may wish for because of the budgetary constraints. We also discussed having to apply thought leadership and look into other avenues through which funds can be raised for NFSs to try and meet the obligations, especially the aspirations, as we would like to see them in the new funding model.
A couple of quick ones before I bring in, other people to these conversations. You mentioned earlier, SAPS, the SAPS, and the hawks involving them in investigations or issues around safety and security as well as fraud. How far did you go with those conversations? In other words, did they go beyond simply saying, we have listened and we've heard you and we promise to do something? Did those conversations go beyond that?
Indeed, they did impressively, because we had written to the South African Police Service as well as to the DPCI previously when we started off with our investigations. And yesterday they were able to present a plan that they had put in place. They had also done inspections and investigations in several institutions of higher learning, and had proposals not only of what they were going to do in terms of their obligations at SABS, but also what they are proposing that the universities within their premises strengthen in respect of their security.
And I must just finish a point that you raised with regard to the fact that the resources are not limitless. So there was a demand, or there has been a demand of holding off on fee increases, for example. And I'm reminded of this point by what you've just said about the fact that even though the issue of the missing middle is indeed being addressed, all of us have to take into account or remember that the resources are not limitless. Was that issue raised at all? Was that part of the conversations?
The issue of the fee increment really was not part of the conversation. It was not part of the allegations letter which we had sent to the parties. SASFE raised it in passing. However, at this stage, I think it's because it is still the beginning of the registrations, so there has not been a firm view from which universities are raising fees and how much are they raising in terms of those fees. But the sense that we got was that there was communication between SASFE, NFSAS, and the universities, because as of yesterday as well, the chairperson of NFSAS was also going out to the field where the registration was taking place, and the leadership of SASFE was also in some of the areas where registrations were taking place.
And when all has been said and done, after all the conversations you had with all, or at least some of the key stakeholders, are you convinced that nothing will impede the registration registration processes this year, especially that of the new students? We're talking about more than 13,000 students will be seeking. Of course, not all of them will be going to tertiary institutions, but most probably the bulk of them, will be or will want to go to tertiary institutions, and they'll be doing so for the very first time. A lot of them are nervous because of what they've seen in the past, but a lot of them will simply not have the money, to be able to begin or start this process of fulfilling their dreams. But from where you are sitting as outsiders, so to speak, looking in, having spoken to everyone, how confident are you that the year will start fairly smoothly? Of course, that will be relevant, but are you confident that by and large things will go smoothly come the time when these new students in particular will have to start registering?
I cannot with utmost confidence say so. Many other factors may come into play. However, what is improved this year is the communication amongst the parties. At least we, since last year, managed to get the parties at least to communicate better, to consult better. And I must say, NFSAS has strengthened its systems from the past. Universities are also more responsive from they were in the past. Higher education also seems to be much better on the roll than what it was in the past. So it might not be utmostly totally no disruptions. However, but I am confident that it would not be as bad as it was in the past years, because we have all around the table committed that we really want to ensure that in future we see a protest-free academic year in institutions of higher learning.
Okay. Advocate Galeka is, of course, staying with us. After the break, Universities South Africa CEO Professor Ahmed Bauer on the state of readiness of that group of tertiary institutions. We'll also have Standiwe Msomi on a private alumni initiative to help needy students. That and more coming up after this short break. Welcome back, and if you've just joined us, good evening to you. We're looking at the state of readiness of the tertiary sector for this year's student intake, while we wait with bated breath for tomorrow's expected release of the public schools' matric results. Those of independent schools were announced today, and according to Independent Examinations Board results published today, the class of 2021's National Senior Certificate pass rate is 98.39%, with nearly all of them, 89.2% to be exact, achieving entry to degree study at a tertiary level. Now, that's 13,825 young South Africans, many of whom will be seeking admission to the country's tertiary institutions and not just universities, I must underline. And that's just those who studied at private schools. Take a look at how some of these young people reacted today after receiving their results.
The euphoria after a successful 12-year school career. At St. Martin's School in Johannesburg, all 55 matrics passed with flying colours. Among them this aspirant lawyer, Siphogo Sithole, who bagged 6 distinctions.
To be honest, it's a lot of hard work, dedication, making sure that I'm, on my case, making sure that I'm working along my classmates, everyone who's here to support me. And I don't know, to be honest, I'm also a bit confused, a bit shocked, and yeah, actually quite excited.
I also got 7 distinctions like my friend Makisawia. I'm planning to study medicine at Stellenbosch University next year.
More excitement at the school. 2 learners pleased with their 100% pass in mathematics.
I'm not fully decided as to university, but I will be going to further education. Right now I'm looking at mathematical sciences with data science.
I'm honestly very happy, a little bit surprised, but very glad. And I worked hard for it, so it's just it's great to see all the hard work come together for a great result.
According to parents and educators, the impressive achievements are a result of teamwork.
It was quite stressful, having everyone home, not having them see their friends, difficulties with online learning, load shedding, but we've made it through all the challenges and it's been fantastic. We're thrilled.
The secret recipe is to work in a partnership with the teachers, the parents and the students, and everybody works together really hard to support each other, to overcome any obstacles so that our students can fly as they have today.
IB matrics who want their papers to be remarked have until the 28th of January to apply. Mahlako Komane, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Only some of the more than 13,000 students who sat for independent exams over the past couple of months. Many of them, of course, in fact, nearly all of them, 89.2% to be exact, achieving entry to degree study at a tertiary level. And all of us, of course, are looking forward to hearing what the Minister of Basic Education, Angie Motshekga, tomorrow will announce with regard to how many of the thousands of students that set for public sector school exams have made it, and how many of those will be able to go to tertiary education institutions. Joining Advocate Galeka, Universities South Africa CEO, Professor Ahmed Bauer, and Standiwe Msomi of the South African Student Solidarity Foundation for Education. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us. Professor Bauer, lots, and I understand those parents, who for now are, full of joy, given, how well this particular group of students, have done against all odds, the COVID-19 pandemic, electricity problems, looting in parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, all sorts of other problems in addition to the usual problems we're all familiar with, things that have happened over the years and the problems of education in general. Just from where you sit as South African universities, any challenges to, this year, given the background that I've just described?
Thank you so much thank you for having me on the program. I think some of the perennial problems, the conditions for them still exist. We still don't have a national system in place for the funding of students who fall outside of the NSFAS category. I'm pleased to hear that, that there are a range of kind of national initiatives to try and address this. But we don't have a system in place yet. And what that means essentially is that the perennial problem of having students who have debt to the universities at the beginning of every academic year, that will continue this year. And the meeting that Advocate Tgaleka spoke about, I think was a very useful meeting. It gave us a chance to really share, where we were coming from and so on. But that does remain a very big challenge. And we were hoping very much that the task team that the minister put together, the ministerial task team that was set up last year, that it would have provided us with some solutions for the beginning of this year, but that hasn't been possible. So that's the one critical issue. It's the issue around student debt, what we spoke with the Deputy Public Protector and the other colleagues who were there was trying to find a kind of a sectoral approach to dealing with the issue of providing graduating students with academic records and so on. That's what we discussed. But the issue around basically the non-affordability of higher education, especially for students that we refer to as being in this missing middle category, we don't have a solution for that yet. So that's one very big challenge that we face.
And we are going to get into that in a bit of detail, hopefully. But outside of that, or apart from that particular problem, the fact that the interministerial task team hasn't perhaps gone as far as all of us would have wished, and of course the broader issue of affordability of education. Outside of those, Prof, any other factor that you think may just be a big one and affect tertiary education this year?
Yeah, we are hoping, that the shortfall that faces NSFAS at the moment, that would be made up, as was indeed done last year. Of course, the challenge is that quite a significant part of that money that went to make up that shortfall last year came out of the university grants to university. Government grants to universities. So, taking from Peter to
robbing Peter
Paul,
to pay Paul.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's not a very good solution, and in fact, it's a bad solution. So we're hoping that there'll be some way that the government addresses that shortfall, but that shortfall has to be met because there's it's a requirement that NSFAS funds those students who qualify for the bursary and are admitted to university. So those students have to be funded. So government has to, I think, step in and make that work. The second, the third issue is the issue around student accommodation. We did a survey of the universities earlier this year in preparation for a meeting with the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. And the general response from the universities was that they had secured enough accommodation. Now, of course, the accommodation is not just the accommodation on the campus, right? So universities also secure off-campus accommodation and so on. But the universities seemed to be fairly comfortable that they did not have a challenge with student accommodation this year.
Well, given then the top two issues that you spoke about, given the situation there, am I to assume or take it for granted that the issue of holding off on fee increases is a non-starter? We are unlikely to see something like that, given the rather difficult situation that universities are finding themselves in. Are we to assume that?
Yeah, so I should say, sorry, I butted in there. What I should say is that, the fee increase is the inflation rate, basically. The fees are going up by the inflation rate. And what that means in essence is that, that the contribution of tuition fees to the university budgets, which is about 35% of the total income of the sector, so that's staying flat, because all you're doing really is ensuring that the buying power remains the same because of the inflation rate. In fact, I'll say that, that our calculations indicate that the inflation rate for higher education is slightly higher than the consumer, that the CPI that is normally used. So I think I should just emphasize that there isn't really. Of course, there's a 4.3% increase in tuition fees, but that's really to keep the spending power at the same level, if you like.
Standuem Somi, you involved as the South African Student Solidarity Foundation for Education in attempts to, get, former students, those who are working and can afford to help, in their own little way. Talk to us about what it is that you're trying to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vuyo, for having us on the show today, and good evening to your listeners and viewers. As SASFE, our work is to fundraise from students who have qualified and got their qualifications and who are now in the labor market in order to almost give back to students in need today. As we know, there are tons of students who are going to be lining up outside of fees offices in different universities. And so it's imperative for those who have benefited from either funding from the state or the private sector who are now in the labor market to give back and to assist the students in need today. As we know, there's a huge gap called the missing middle. And even those who do fall under the NSFAS threshold don't always make it into the funding system of NSFAS. From rules such as the N+2 rule to the recent rule where you have to pass 75% of your modules. These are things that students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds can find themselves failing and spending more time in universities, and they're left outside of the periphery. So as SASFE, we acknowledge that throughout the fiscus, the budget cuts that have been put on the higher education sector really cannot cope with the demand for higher education. And so when you can't get any assistance from the private sector or the public sector, one portion of society to look at is those who have benefited from higher education and have the earning capacity to donate towards those who need higher education today.
Well, what has the response been like? Have people been forthcoming or as forthcoming?
Yeah, the response has definitely been quite impressive in that last year during the 2021 protests that were marked by the hashtag Wits Asina Mali, SASFE was able to donate quite a bit of funds to the Wits SRC to assist the students who were in need. But I must say that the state of our economy has resulted in so many people either being unemployed or people earning very, very little salaries. We live in a country where a student can study an engineering degree for 4 or 5 years, and all they can get is a graduate employment opportunity that pays them 4.5 grand. And so how do you then ask that person to donate towards someone who's just starting out in their first year when they themselves can't even have a decent way to live a normal life and have social mobility. And so even though fundraising from students or former students rather who are now in the labor market is a viable option in the state of our economy that has shrunk by 7% in 2020, people's incomes are lower. And so if we had to solely rely on fundraising from students who are now in the labor market, I don't think the amount of funds raised through that would be enough to meet the demand for higher education.
Advocate Taleka, I mean, since you've had the privilege that the rest of us don't have of bringing together all these people from the presidency, from treasury, from higher education, and a whole host of others, have you been able to put a finger on why the interministerial task team in particular has not been able to get to a point where many stakeholders would have thought that they would have gotten by now?
You know, what they mentioned is that the kind of work that they were tasked with has actually required them to get other expert skills outside from the skills within the ministerial task team. So this, of course, has taken a bit of time. The report had gone to cabinet, which is another process, consultation with those who are affected with the report, consolidating those responses, and also now the minister considering those before finalizing and publicizing the report.
Well, since you are the public protectors, any chance you could, put pressure, on the people in government to actually try and move with speed on these things?
We have actually asked the Deputy Minister that he conveys to the Minister that it would really be of assistance to all parties involved if this report would be released as soon as possible, so that everyone can have an outlook of what the issues are and how these issues are going to be attended to. And he has committed to do so. But from our side as well, we will be writing to the Minister, because we had requested a copy of the report so that indeed we can see that the issues that we have asked that they be addressed from the interactions that we've had with the minister last year actually do find expression within the report.
Professor Bauer, I mean, when everyone knows that the meals of government tend to grind rather slowly, just from where you sit, is it for lack of trying, or are the issues much more complex than they seem, or is it just tardiness, or what do you think because you would have thought that the interministerial task team would move with speed given the pre-COVID experiences, and that as things are getting better and people are able to gather and move together, they would try and give this a priority so as to avoid some of the violent protests and that sort of thing that we've seen in the past.
The department has got exceptional people working on it. I mean, some very, very good people working in it. The problem is that it's just doesn't have the capacity. I don't mean capacity as in skills. It just doesn't have the sufficient number of people to do the work that's required of it. And I think that's something that we've been saying for quite a while now, which is that the department really needs to step up and really bolster its capacity to take on these very large projects. By the way, this is just one of them. There are many of them that have not been resolved. That had been started, that reports were produced, but then implementation kind of collapses. So it seems to me, at least, that that has to be one of the messages that goes to government more generally, I guess, that it has to build a capacity to do policy work, to produce policy guidelines, to institute new actions and innovations and so on. And that's something that we work very well with the department, by the way, but it is a lack of capacity in my view.
Mm-hmm. Standiwe, what can the rest of us still do?
I mean, the rest of us in our own individual contribute to the conversation around particularly looking at sustainable ways to fund higher education. And the premise of all of that, I think, is from the genesis of the Fees Must Fall movement, which is free education in this country. It's an issue as well that has very find people who are for it and those who say no, if you do it, the economy will collapse. But at this point in time, our government is only spending less than 1% as a percentage of our GDP on higher education. And so when it comes to the higher education sector not having the capacity to do the necessary policy work or not enough money going into SASFE, we all have to reach one understanding of the fact that if we don't act now, we don't pressurize governments to increase funding into higher education, we may potentially increase inequality in this country and continue to exclude more and more students at this point in time. Second thing that I think would also be very effective in trying to curb this situation, at least in the short term, is to look at how the private sector can get involved in funding higher education and finding sustainable solutions to it. The private sector is one of the biggest consumers of education. And so it's only right that more students receive funding from companies that can commit to taking in more students who need the finances to get through their university education. And to also look at the conditions of the types of bursaries that they extend to students. Because sometimes they'll extend a bursary that has stringent conditions that may not be suitable for a student who may not perhaps come from an IEB school. And so the endemic inequalities within our education system affect students when they get to universities. And sometimes the funding models that are used are completely not aligned with the individual situation of the student. And so we call on the private sector to re-examine how exactly they extend financing and funding to students who are deserving and who have the merits to get into universities, so that students don't find themselves, when they're in the system, facing the challenge of getting out of the system due to many circumstances that they may incur. But I think at the core of it, we need to have a discussion in this country about how we enact free education. This is something that's also available in many developed nations, such as the Czech Republic and in Germany as well. Education is seen as a public good. Yet in our country, there's still a private good element to education. And if developed countries can do it, then why can't South Africa do it? We need to grow our economy so that we can actually finance more students within the higher education sector. And I think once government and other stakeholders in society meet in minds and agree in that, perhaps we could find a long-term sustainable solution to the funding crisis that we see, both for students and universities. Okay.
Very quickly, Advocate Kalega, what happens to the conversations you've been having? Have you agreed on a program going forward, or what needs to happen, or is it just the end of it? You're hoping and praying that the people who have some work to do indeed do what is expected of them?
Of course, there is a program going forward. Timeframes have been given to the parties so that we ensure that there is some settlement on the issues that have been raised. Where there is no settlement, we will investigate those issues. In fact, we've already started with the investigations. So it would just be to consolidate. And where we find that there are adverse findings against the parties, we will then issue preliminary reports, expect their responses, and then a final report. And where we find against the parties remedial action, and as you are aware, the remedial actions of the public protector are binding, the parties will have to implement those or take us to court and review.
Okay, that's where we're going to leave it. Special thanks to all of you, Professor Ahmed Bauer, Standiwe Msomi, and Advocate Kalega. And that's our program for this evening. To join us again tomorrow evening, same time, 8 p.m. sharp. Good night.